Hello again, everyone. This is Miss Peachy from WCA Biology B. Here we are doing Unit 7, Lesson 6, Competitive Advantage. So there's like two distinctly separate parts to this lesson. I almost feel like it should be completely two different lessons, but they combine them into one. So we'll go through both of them, but there's kind of a really big, I guess, break in between the two of them. They're just very different from each other. Our key terms are adapted, competitive advantage, niche, adaptive radiation, evolution, and resource partitioning. And those are the ones from the first part. And then when we get to the second part, which they're not listed in the key terms, we have other terms here that are really important. We have innate and learned behaviors. We have taxis, kinesis, and reflex. We have migration, fixed action patterns, and stereotypy. We have imprinting, habituation, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. And so all those behaviors are just very separate. I feel like they should be pulled out and put in a separate lesson here, but I didn't design this, so we're just going to go with it. All right. So, isn't it beautiful? Wouldn't you just love to go there right now? Oh man, it's snowing outside. Kind of junky here in Wisconsin, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty darn cold. There's an ice storm. It might be kind of hard driving home this afternoon, but the Galapagos Islands looks very, very beautiful. So they are found off the coast of South America in the eastern Pacific Ocean. They are a volcanic archipelago, like a chain of volcanic islands. They're relatively new, geologically speaking, just a few million years old, and they're just full of a lot of diversity. They're very interesting in studying evolution because they are separated from each other, being a chain of islands. They're fairly close to the mainland, and so they make for some interesting study with the species of finches. Um, the iguanas that live there, the turtle or the tortoises that live on the islands as well. So in any case, Charles Darwin, amongst many, studied the Galapagos finches. Probably the first one to study and really see the significance of them in learning about natural selection. And what he noticed is that on the different islands of the Galapagos, that there's a multitude of different types of finches that are all very similar to each other, but yet have distinct differences, specifically in the size and shape of their beaks. But they're all otherwise very, very similar to each other. So we have a couple of terms here that some are reviews, and they do introduce biological niche here, which I've been saying for a long, long time. And I really wanted to give you the definition. So, a term that describes the habitat and resources used by a species or population along with its interactions with other species within an ecosystem. That's a great definition because niche does not just describe a physical place that an organism lives, but also the role that it plays in that environment, its interactions, and that kind of stuff. So, as we've said earlier, and they haven't talked about it yet, in ecology, there's something called the competitive exclusion principle. And that states that no two species can occupy the same niche in the same habitat at the same time because of competition. So organisms will compete with each other to be able to fill that particular niche. As competition is happening, only that organism that is best suited to fill that niche is going to survive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But what Darwin noticed is again this kind of variety of different finches that are all very similar to each other. And what we could see here is that all of these finches evolved from a common finch that was found on the mainland of South America. So this is where the geography of the place becomes kind of significant. It's close enough to the mainland of South America that finches from the mainland could have migrated to the islands. But the islands are so different from each other and from the mainland that finches that migrated to those islands had to have different adaptations to make them successful in that particular island, right? So it's really geographic isolation that we're talking about here. And remember, we talked about the pandas in our previous lesson. Here, these finches are all in very, very different ecosystems. And so, what the physical adaptations, the behavioral adaptations that make them successful is going to be different based upon the ecosystem that they're in. So, this type of adaptation is known as adaptive radiation. It's a type of evolution that shows quick change, um, like a really fast change and kind of a wide variety of change over a short period of time. So when I click on adaptive radiation, it says an evolutionary phenomenon in which populations of a single ancestral species become isolated and adapt to different ecosystems, evolving adaptations specific for that environment, which results in the evolution of several different but related species from a single ancestor over a relatively short amount of time from a geological perspective. So could be over, thousands of years. That's a relatively short geologic time. We're not talking about something that happens overnight, just so we know. Geologic time is very vast, and so short and long are really not what we would consider short and long. Now, Darwin didn't know anything about DNA or genomes or anything like that. But his observations of the anatomy and behavior of the finches led him to a similar conclusion about evolutionary relationships between these species. His explanation for such rapid evolution of this species still holds true today. You have different characteristics and behaviors compared to others. He reasoned that some individuals have a competitive advantage. So, this is a trait that gives it a greater chance of surviving and reproducing in a given environment, right? And so this competitive advantage gave them more of an opportunity to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes, their traits, their adaptations to the next generation. And over time, you just get more and more of the organisms that have that successful adaptation within your population, because if you don't, you don't make it. You can't compete, you can't get food, and so you die. It's really just as simple as that. And that's why it doesn't take a long time to happen, simply because like you have it or you die. So that adaptation is literally the determining factor in change here. Now, one of the biggest adaptations we're talking about here are the size and shapes of the beaks. And the size and shapes of the beaks really goes along with the predominant food source that's found on these specific islands. And you can kind of see the shapes of the beaks here, and you'll have this in your lesson as well. And it'll tell you what the food source is here, right? So these are seed eaters, and their bills are designed for crushing seeds. So they have crushing bills. Here's our cactus eater and insect eaters. These guys are designed for probing. So probing into trees and cacti to get insects out of them, or probing into cactuses to get the nectar out of it or whatever. Our tree finches here, we have grasping bills and parrot-like bills depending on the source of the food that they eat. So their bill shape corresponds with their primary food source. And that bill shape is really a determining factor of how we define each of these specific species. They eat different foods completely because they kind of occupy different niches. Um, then we go on a lot later, and we've already talked about Rosemary and Peter Grant in a previous lesson, but they also lived and studied in the Galapagos Islands, but this is much later in the 1970s. And so their focus was to study the birds, measure their beaks, observe their behavior, learn their diets, their mating calls. They observed birds over multiple generations. They cataloged the birds, they tagged them and cataloged them when they died and how many eggs they laid and how many young they had. And there's just a lot of information that they were able to compile. And what they did notice is that birds sometimes ignored other birds in a different species when they were nearby. So there wasn't always competition that happened, right? Just because two birds lived in the same area didn't mean they were directly in competition with each other. And so this phenomenon is known as resource partitioning. This is where two species will live in the same area, but because they use different resources, they're able to kind of avoid competition. Because obviously, in a competitive environment, if you've got two species using the same resources, one of them is not going to make it. So it's automatically only giving you a 50% chance of survival. If you can utilize different resources, it really increases the chance of survival of that species. So resource partitioning is a way in which a species can kind of, if they're flexible enough within their needs to be able to increase the odds of survivability. And we see this a lot in different resources. Excuse me, I'm a little bit congested today. So let's see here. The other thing they noticed is that as the climate changed, so through times of major droughts and heavy rainfalls, that the allele frequency, the type of beaks that we saw on these birds, um, waxed and waned. For example, um, let's see, during a time of major drought, the small soft seeds were eaten quickly and then they disappeared. So birds that had the beaks that could only eat the small soft seeds kind of died out. And only those birds that had the larger beaks that could crack open the bigger tough seeds were able to survive. So we saw an increase in the population of birds that could eat these larger seeds and a decrease in the population of the birds that could eat the softer seeds. And, when the drought went away and the rainfall resumed, we saw kind of that population stabilize again. But if you could imagine that change was more permanent, then the change in populations would be more permanent as well, and to a point where you might end up with a whole species of birds that went extinct. Let's see here. It's pretty much everything. I mean, there's multiple different things that they studied, but that's kind of like the gist of it. All right, and so then we go on to our second part because there's going to be some questions on all the stuff we just learned. And then it goes on to, oh, I'm sorry, I missed this part here, but it goes on to talk about how, and then later on in 2003, now we're getting into more of the time where we have a little bit more knowledge of genotyping and stuff like that. And so they've discovered here, Rosemary and Peter Grant studies actually has been able to locate the gene responsible for changing the beak size. They discovered a gene called HMGA2 that controls the physical shape of the beaks. So literally there is a gene that's passed on from one generation to the next. If you have the gene that controls for larger beak size, then your offspring will be more likely to have that larger beak size as well, right? So we kind of knew that already, I think, because we saw that hereditarily that happened, but they were actually able to locate the gene that did that. All right, so then we're moving on to that second part. And we get to slide 11, and it talks about innate versus learned behaviors. Just like I said, a completely different section. I don't know why it's in the same lesson, but well, whatever. So innate versus learned behaviors. So remember, adaptations can be physical, they can be physiological, or they can be anatomical, but they can also be behavioral. So maybe this is where this fits in, just because we're talking about adaptations and behaviors are a type of adaptation. First starts talking about Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov is famous in this example is famous in its description of classical conditioning, which is a type of learned behavior. And we'll talk more about classical conditioning coming up. They'll define it later. Essentially, he studied dogs. I don't know, he studied behavior. And in this study, he was looking at trying to control the behavior of dogs, trying to see if you could condition a dog to do something that was innate in a learned way, I guess. So essentially, the idea is that dogs will drool when they're presented with food. It's completely innate. You cannot control that. It's innate, meaning that it's inborn. It's something that they just do naturally. If you have a dog, you probably notice that they drool, especially if you're going to feed them, right? I don't have dogs, but I've seen drooly dogs before. So he actually put a little probe in their mouth and measured how much they drooled. And if they put food by the dog would drool more than they would if they didn't have the food by the dog. And what they ended up doing was they discovered that they could associate this natural innate behavior with a stimulus by ringing a bell. So he rang a bell every time he presented the dog with food. So every time the dog drooled, he um, with the food presentation, a bell would be ringing. So this triggered eventually a learned behavior. The dog learned that if a bell rang, he was going to get food. And as a result, an innate behavior of drooling manifested because of the bell ringing. So over time, he could take the food away and ring the bell, and the dog would still drool, even if there was no food at all. So that's something called classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is where you can take something that's innate, like drooling, and you can associate it with something that's learned, like the ringing of a bell. And so that the learned stimuli, the bell ringing, can actually trigger an innate behavior. So that's called classical conditioning. So we'll talk a little bit more about learned and innate behaviors in the next couple of slides. So innate behaviors are also called instincts, kind of. I mean, sometimes. They're part of your genome. They're encoded in at the level of your genes. So you can't control them. You're just born with them. If it is innate, it has to be inborn. So it says practice doesn't make perfect. Innate behaviors are fully functional the first time an organism attempts them and every time thereafter. So there are three types of innate behaviors. The simplest are taxis, kinesis, and reflex. So taxis, which is pronounced taxis and not taxis, which I have no idea why they would try to put a picture of a taxi here just to be funny. It's really not necessary. So this is a form of behavior that involves movement to or away from a stimulus. A moth to the flame, right? So if you have fire, if you ever had a campfire and moths just fly into it, that is a form of taxis. Why do they do it? They just can't help it. They're literally born being attracted to light. They're innately drawn to it. So you might think, what a stupid moth, but they have no control over that reflex. Kinesis is similar to taxis, but it is in a behavior in a way that is non-directional. The organism does not move directly toward or away from a stimulus. Instead, movement is random and can be in any direction. If you turn over a leaf where a pill bug is hiding, it will run about briefly before curling up into a tight ball. So it's not toward or away from the stimulus. It's just that the stimulus literally triggers random movement. And reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus. When you touch something hot, you will automatically pull your hand away. You don't have any control over that generally. It is sudden, involuntary, and immediate. Reflexes, as a side note, the nerve impulse doesn't even make it to your brain, so there's no decision making that's going on at all. The nerve impulse is relayed to your spinal cord and back. So it's actually a short trip in order for that nerve impulse to trigger the muscle contraction that causes your hand to be withdrawn away. And then we have more complex innate behaviors, including migrations, fixed action patterns, and stereotypy. I think we all know what migrations are. We live in Wisconsin. All of our birds, well, a lot of our birds migrate south for the winter. It appears to be learned. It's not learned. Birds are inborn and know how to migrate right away. Fixed action patterns are a more complex series of events triggered by a stimulus. I mean, they have a couple of examples here. Let's see. One of them that I've learned about is if you take an egg out of the nest of like a duck or goose, they will immediately roll that egg back in their nest. And that is a fixed action pattern. It's a complex behavior, but they don't have any control over it. They know instinctively to roll that egg back into the nest. And again, complex because there's multiple steps to it, but it is innate. It is something they're born with. And stereotypies are involuntary behaviors that involve repetition of motions or sounds. says if you ever see people flap their hands in excitement or agitation, you have witnessed stereotyping. That's actually one I'm not really familiar with. And then finally, we have our learned behaviors. So these are complex behaviors, but you have to learn them. It's not something you're born with, and you can get better at it as you go. Um, Imprinting, they're listing here, is a type of learned behavior that is phase sensitive. It only happens at certain stages of life. Generally, newborn animals will fixate on the first animal or object that it encounters, and it will imprint upon it as though it were its mother. This one's actually a bit different because it's kind of partially innate as well. It is something they're born with, the ability to imprint, but they learn to follow a specific object depending on what object is near them when they are born. Oftentimes, that object does have to have certain physical characteristics for them to imprint upon it. Habituation is a learned behavior as well. So, habituation is an example where animals will learn to ignore a stimulus that is neither helpful nor harmful because it just requires excess energy on their part if it has no effect on them. And a good example of a habituation is, say you ever seen like animals like crows and stuff at the side of the road, and they're just kind of feasting on carcass or whatever on the side of the road, and they're just kind of ignoring the cars as they drive by. The crows have learned over time that in general there really isn't any risk to them to feasting on something on the side of the highway, that all those noisy cars that are driving by aren't harmful to them at all. So why waste the energy on paying attention to them when there's a yummy dead deer carcass that they can feast on right next to the side of the road? And then we get to our two types of conditioning. We talked about classical conditioning, and this is the one that Ivan Pavlov demonstrated through his dog and bell study that we mentioned earlier. The other type of conditioning is called operant conditioning, and this is kind of like your reward and punishment type of conditioning. So this is a learned behavior that you either reinforce good behavior or through rewards, right? Or reinforce a type of behavior, I should say, good or bad, through rewards. You have to repeat the behavior because you're being rewarded for it, or you avoid a certain behavior because it produces a punishment, right? Um, let's see here. So a good example of this is, I guess, shaking the treat bag so your cats and dogs come to get the food, right? They're learning that the sound of the treat bag means food. And so that's a learned behavior, and they're being rewarded for coming. Maybe they have to do a trick or whatever to get that food. But just coming to get the food is is the response really, and the reward is the treat that they're giving. So it's going to give you a couple of examples of those as well. You can read those and kind of see, differences in the different types of examples for operant conditioning. And that's it, guys. That's all of lesson 6. Like I said, it's kind of distinctly two different parts, so in my opinion, it should have been two different lessons. But hopefully you learned something new. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, take care, everybody. See you in the next one.